Traditions. Traditions can blind us from the truth and cause us to wander in the myopic fog of man-made religious systems for an entire lifetime. Many of the traditions of the Western Gentile Christian Church are merely adapted pagan sun god worship rituals inherited from our ancestors. They were forced to compromise with the Roman Emperor Constantine or lose their life for refusing to bow. Most of these traditions were imported directly from Babylon. In fact, there's not a single religion practiced upon the face of the earth today that has not been polluted by Nimrod's rebellion against the one true God. I'm Michael Rood. Prepare for a rude awakening. If you, like I, grew up in Western civilization, by the time you were 3 years old, you knew that on Christmas Eve, a pot-bellied man in a cherry red suit dropped through the chimney and placed presents under an evergreen tree festooned with gold and silver balls. Christian children were told that this was a celebration of the birth of the baby Jesus. And at the time, you were neither intellectually or philosophically capable of refuting the validity of this tradition. But by the time you entered kindergarten and the debates among your classmates raged, you perceived that you had been told a lie. Your concept of reality was shaken. Tears flooded your eyes as you came to the realization there is no Santa Claus. The Hebrew Scriptures expose the perverted traditions of man-made religions and offer reality to those who hunger and thirst for truth. Shaul, commonly known as the Apostle Paul, wrote that we should not be misled by traditions and commandments of men, but rather rely upon a tested and proven source of truth, the Torah, the 5 books of Moses. The children of Israel camped at Mount Sinai for an entire year as Moses passed on the instructions from the Creator. These instructions, called Torah in Hebrew, taught us how to govern ourselves and throw off the shackles of man-made religious, political, and economic systems. Joshua, or as many know him by his Gentile nickname Jesus, warned his followers that traditions promulgated by religious leaders are like leaven or yeast, which once mingled with dough cannot be removed. Without the Torah of God, it is impossible to separate the traditions of men from the rules of the Almighty. Rudimentary explanation. The English word tradition is derived from the Latin tradiere, which means to lay into the hands of another. When someone lays something into your hands, you expect that the intention of the gift is good. Thank you. But it is the responsibility of the recipient to inspect the gift. Yeah! Traditions can be good or evil. The recipient must carefully inspect that which is laid into his hands. I hate when that happens. Jeremiah said that in the last days, the Gentiles would come to Israel and cry out in repentance, "Surely our fathers have inherited lies." If our fathers inherited a lie, what they pass on to us does not magically become the truth by virtue of their sincerity. Traditions are given to us in innocence and accepted in ignorance. We are like the blind following the blind. Those who are leading us may not have any intention of misleading us, but they are nonetheless blind. And we will both certainly fall into a ditch unless we have our eyes open to the truth. But what is truth? Truth means reality, that which is. Truth is reality whether one believes it or not. One can believe a lie his entire life, and it will never change into truth just to suit his belief system. If we are to live the truth, we must be willing to constantly challenge the traditions and teachings that we've inherited from our parents and religious systems, as well as our own thinking patterns. I was an adult before I questioned the pictures in my mind of Daniel as a young boy standing safely in the lion's den. Once that picture was embedded, I had no reason to question its validity. Years later, however, a new picture developed from the scriptures, an old Daniel, 80-ish, who had been a ruler of Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, and now Darius, who was tricked into commanding that Daniel, his vice president, be executed. Daniel and his Jewish companions, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, were raised in Jerusalem and taught the scriptures from their youth. When they were carried away as captives into Babylon, they were renamed Belteshazzar, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and made eunuchs under the care of Ashpenaz, master of eunuchs, and trained for service in the court of the king. Daniel was promoted to prime minister under King Nebuchadnezzar and was made an extremely wealthy young man. Daniel was multiplied in wealth twice more during the reigns of Belshazzar and again under Darius the Mede. Daniel was one of the richest men in the kingdom. For more than 60 years, Daniel was in charge of the Chaldeans, a group of highly trained astronomers, intellectuals, among whom were many Judean captives. Near the end of his life, Daniel was visited by the angel Gabriel and given very exact timing concerning the coming of the Messiah. But he was also instructed to seal up some of the information. Apparently, it was for him, and for him alone, to understand and act upon. Daniel died in Babylon, a eunuch, with no heir to whom he could leave his wealth. It would be the acme of foolishness to assume that a man as wealthy and prophetically well-informed as Daniel would not have made very careful plans for the distribution of his treasure. After the 70 years of captivity had ended, many of the Jews, especially those in positions of responsibility, stayed behind in Babylon, the most notable being Mordecai and his niece Hadassah, better known as Queen Esther. Daniel would have naturally assigned the execution of his will to his most trusted companions, the Jewish Chaldean astronomers whom he trained and who remained behind in Babylon. There is a reason for every word in the Scriptures, regardless of how trivial these details may seem to us. By carefully considering the Scriptures and historical records, we often see very compelling pictures develop from the text. So, what became of Daniel's estate? It will be nearly 500 years before any hint of Daniel's treasure reappears in the pages of the Scriptures. How many wise men came to present gifts to Jesus? Where did they find him, and how was he dressed?
There were 3 wise men. He was lying in a manger, and I believe he was in swaddling clothes.
I believe there were 3 wise men.
Of course, 3.
3?
Yes, 3.
The way I understand, it was 3 wise men who came to visit Jesus. He was found in a manger.
In a manger.
In a manger.
And I believe he was wearing swaddling cloths.
In swaddling clothes.
Actually, he was dressed in a swaddling clothes.
In swaddling clothes.
Ask the man or woman on the street, how many wise men came to present gifts to Jesus? Where did they find him, and how was he dressed? As you can see, the common answer is 3 wise men found the newborn babe wrapped in swaddling clothes lying in a manger. That, however, is not the testimony of the Scriptures. We read in the King James Version of Matthew's account that an undesignated number of wise men, in the Greek magi, came to the house where they found the young child, Yahshua, living with his mother Miriam and Joseph. In the Gospel of Luke, we read that only the shepherds arrived at the manger. Sorry for this rude interruption, but Yahshua was actually born on the first day of the Feast of Tabernacles, the 15th day of the 7th month on the biblical calendar, which always occurs in autumn, not December 25th when the pagan sun gods were said to be born. His birth was an intermediate fulfillment of the Feast of Sukkot, or mangers. It is the same word in the Hebrew language. Joseph was required to live in a sukkah or tabernacle during the entire 7-day feast. Miriam, his pregnant wife, was not required to live in the sukkah, but the Bethlehem bed and breakfast was completely booked. So she joined her husband in the sukkah on the first day of the Feast of Sukkot and delivered her firstborn son in the sukkah. That is the moment when the Word was made flesh and Sukkoted, or tabernacled. In the King James Version, dwelt among us. To suggest that a lonesome trio, laden with treasure, crossed the torrid sands of the desert outside the protection of a large armed caravan exposes a lack of sound thinking. They would not have been wise men, but fools to venture unaccompanied through the wilderness. These magi, a common term for Chaldean astronomers, were the descendants of the very Jewish astronomers Daniel trained and entrusted with his treasure. Following Daniel's instruction, the astronomers watched the skies for more than 500 years, searching for the great sign in the heavens that finally occurred on Tishri 1 at the end of the 4th millennium. The constellation Betula, the Virgin, clothed with the setting sun, the first sliver of the new moon beneath her feet, and in the 12 stars above her head, the planet Hatzadik, the righteous, came into conjunction with the star Hamelech, the king, in the constellation of Ariel, the Lion of Judah. On the first day of the month of Tishri, on Yom Teruah, the Day of Trumpets, this one-time celestial alignment announced the upcoming birth of the Melech Tzaddik, the righteous King of Kings, the Lion of the tribe of Judah. Daniel had made provision for the Messiah, and now, 500 years later, the executors of his will brought their treasure-laden caravan into the city gates of Jerusalem with the proclamation, "We have come to worship He who is born King of the Jews." Herod sent them to the neighboring village of Bethlehem, where the prophet Micah said the Mashiach would be born. The very night that Joseph was commanded in a vision to take the child and his mother and flee into Egypt, the night that Herod's orders to execute all male babies was issued, Daniel's treasure was delivered right to their door. Think about it. Joseph was so impoverished that he could only afford the poor man's sacrifice of 2 pigeons at the child's dedication, 40 days after his birth. Certainly, Joseph was not yet in possession of any gold, frankincense, or myrrh. But approximately a year and a half later, on the very night they had to escape into Egypt, the provision for their flight and sustenance arrived by special courier. That provision had been made 500 years earlier and prepared for the moment it was needed. The Almighty is the master of drama. When there appears to be no hope, His salvation is revealed. Truth is always more exciting than fictitious traditions and fairy tales based on ignorance of the Scriptures. Leave your Western Gentile mentality behind as we explore the Bible from a Jewish or Hebrew perspective. This is the paradigm shift for which you have been waiting an entire lifetime. In the book of Ezekiel, he wrote, "The angel brought me to the gate of the house of the Lord, and I beheld women weeping for Tammuz. Then said he unto me, Thou shalt see greater abominations. And he brought me into the inner court, where about 25 men had their back toward the temple, and they faced the east and worshiped the sun." Sun worship and the worship of Tammuz started in ancient Babylon. Nimrod built a city that was the center of his world government in which he was proclaimed God. His kingdom bore totalitarian rule over the people, reducing men to slaves in his political, economic, and religious system. According to ancient Jewish writings, Nimrod was slain by Noah's son Shem, and his body parts were scattered throughout the land of Shinar. Nimrod's devoted followers erected a tower that reached into the heavens, a huge obelisk like we see here in Caesarea, and in Washington, D.C., Heliopolis, Egypt, Rome, London, Paris, and New York City. This phallic symbol is the image of the uncircumcised penis of Nimrod, the father of Babylonian sun god worship. The Creator calls this the image of jealousy and an abomination. This Roman-created abomination, found recently in its proper state, toppled over and in pieces, was rebuilt in the summer of 2001. In the month of its completion, a gay pride parade was held in Tel Aviv, a befitting inauguration for this obelisk re-erection, and in the month of Tammuz, no less. Nimrod's widow Beltus, also known as Semiramis, not willing to let the kingdom slip through her fingers when her husband was killed, proclaimed that Nimrod had ascended into the heavens, was now the sun god, and that he had impregnated her with the rays of the sun. At least that was her story. Her child was born on the winter solstice, on the ancient calendar, December 25th. Forevermore, this day would be celebrated as the day that Nimrod, the sun god, was reborn as Tammuz. The birth date of the Babylonian sun god is a shock to some in the West, but common knowledge among Jewish scholars and historians. Israel was taken captive into Babylon for their disobedience concerning sun god worship. We had also been captives in Egypt, where we took on the worship of Ra, the Egyptian sun god, who was born on December 25th. In 168 BC, the Syrian Greek general Antiochus Epiphanes occupied Jerusalem and set up a statue of Zeus in the temple on Zeus's birthday, and proclaimed that Zeus was God on December 25th. And when Rome conquered Jerusalem, they hung Jewish patriots on the cross of Mithra as a sacrifice to the Roman sun god who was born on, you guessed it, December 25th. The confusion of languages at the Tower of Babel scattered the heathen into the far corners of the earth and confused the names of their gods. But the worship rituals remain much the same throughout the earth. There is one date that I assure you Yahshua of Nazareth was not born, December 25th. But who was? Little baby Tammuz. Tammuz, so the story goes, was gored to death by a wild boar in a hunting accident when he was 40 years old. The 40 days of weeping for Tammuz was instituted, one day for each year of his life, in which sun god worshippers would deny themselves a pleasure in this life for the sake of Tammuz's pleasure in the afterlife. When Tammuz's mother died many years later, the exalted Queen of Heaven was sent back to earth by the gods on the first Sunday after the vernal equinox. Nimrod's wife arrived in a giant egg which landed in the Euphrates River and broke open to allow her to emerge, reincarnated as the bare-breasted goddess of sexual desire, Easter. To proclaim her divinity, Easter changed a bird into an egg-laying rabbit. In this dingy Hinnom Valley Tammuz cave, the occult priest would impregnate virgins on the altar of Easter at the Easter sunrise service, and a year later they sacrificed those 3-month-old infants on the same altar and dyed Easter eggs in the blood of those sacrificed babies. To this day, one Christian denomination only allows their Easter eggs to be dyed a single specific color, blood red. They have no idea how the tradition started or what it rehearses. But now you know. Easter Sunday is now the day that culminates the 40 days of weeping for Tammuz, called by many Lent. On this day, entire denominations continue a tradition of slaughtering the wild boar that killed Tammuz and eating ham on Easter Sunday. There is one date that I assure you Yahshua did not rise from the grave, Easter Sunday. Frequently, Easter and Passover are an entire month apart. Why? They represent the worship of two different gods. Easter is celebrated according to a pagan sun god calendar. Passover is celebrated according to the observance of the biblical new moon and the ripening of the barley in the land of Israel. Yahshua kept the feast of Passover. All of the rehearsals that were embedded in that feast were fulfilled the year of his death and resurrection. He was the final Passover sacrifice. His sinless blood paid the price for our redemption. On the other hand, Easter is a rehearsal of child sacrifice and fertility rites of pagan sun god worshippers. Which celebration should you keep? That depends on which god you serve. It's your choice. But now you understand why the Holy One instructs us. Do not learn the way of the heathen and how they worship their gods and then do the same to me. It is an abomination. Christmas and Easter are not the celebrations of the birth and resurrection of Yahshua of Nazareth, but the watered-down continuation of child sacrifice festivals that were hatched in Babylon 2,000 years before his birth. We all recognize that the pagan calendar, which has been adopted by the Christian world, names every day of the week and nearly every month of the year after a pagan god or fallen angel. But many are surprised to see that the fourth month on the modern Jewish calendar is named after the pagan god Tammuz. In direct violation of the Torah, thou shalt not allow the names of other gods to come out of your mouth. I only speak the names of pagan gods for the same reasons that the prophets of Israel spoke their names, to expose the sick, twisted traditions that we have inherited from our disobedient ancestors. Religious schemes have been fabricated by the mind of man that have nothing to do with how God desires to be worshipped. Pop Christian culture adorns itself with the latest hip Jesus apparel and jewelry that asked, WWJD, what would Jesus do? But seldom opens the scriptures to find out. Yahshua found the place where it was written, said what was written, and did what was written. He did not make up his own theology as he went along. He always obeyed the Torah and said that the Father seeks those who would worship him in spirit and in the truth that was written in stone over 3,400 years ago. When we are ignorant of his instructions, we naturally slip back into Babylonian sun god worship, while we say we are doing it for him. Israel expressed the same ignorance of God's ways when we built a golden calf and said, tomorrow is a feast to Yahweh. He was absolutely furious. He wanted to incinerate us all. Occasionally I hear the emotionally charged defense, that is not what Christmas and Easter mean to me. But I don't care what they mean to you. I don't worship you. The Almighty says that it is an abomination to him. Just as the Almighty told Abraham in Genesis, he tells those living at the end of the age in the book of Revelation, come out of Babylon. Yeah! Throughout this series, we will be exploring the Hebrew Scriptures, both Testaments, from an Hebraic or Jewish perspective. The Great Commission was to the Jew first, and the Jewish disciples gave their lives to spread the good news of the Messiah to the Gentile world. We are going to let the Jews interpret the Scriptures that the Jews have written, and I promise to give ample time to allow the Gentiles to interpret all the Scriptures that the Gentiles have written. I'm Michael Rood, inviting you to join us again next time for A Rude Awakening. And I'll see you when the smoke clears.
It has been called the Day of Days. It is a time of magic, pageantry, warmth, generosity, and love. For many of us, our fondest childhood memories revolve around the traditions of Christmas. It is a time that many around the world celebrate as the birth of Jesus Christ, the Savior and Messiah of mankind. In recent years, however, the spiritual holiday has become a time of mass marketing and crass commercialism. Incredibly, many businesses derive more than half their yearly income during this period. The process of gift giving, once thought to have come from the story of the wise men who offered gifts to the newborn Christ, has evolved into the buying frenzy we see today during the month of December. But what about the other Christmas traditions? Have you ever wondered why we decorate the Christmas tree? Why we light the Yule log? Why we hang the mistletoe? And why we teach our children to believe in Santa Claus? In the next hour, you will discover the true origins of Christmas, You may be surprised or even shocked to learn the source of your favorite holiday traditions. Chances are you'll never look at Christmas the same ever again. In the Northern Hemisphere during late December, the days are at their shortest lengths and the nights are at their longest. For those of the pagan world, this has always been the greatest time of the year to celebrate and practice the works of darkness. The pagan calendar identifies this period as the winter solstice. It was during the pre-Christian midwinter pagan celebrations of Scandinavia's Norsemen where today's Christmas traditions began. As a means of honoring the pagan sex and fertility god Yule, a 12-day celebration during the month of December was inaugurated. A large single log considered to be a phallic idol was lit on fire and kept burning for 12 days. Animal or human sacrifices were offered in the fire on each of those days. Wild, delirious reveling accompanied the daily sacrifices as drunken participants defiantly strove to make contact with spirits. 1,000 miles away in pre-Christian Rome, celebrants were paying homage to their own gods during the winter solstice. Witchcraft traditions hold that a number of pagan gods were given birth during this period, including Dionysus, Attis, and Baal, chief male god of fertility and licentiousness. Another pagan god from Persia, identified as Mithra, was said to have been born specifically on December 25th. Mithra was the god of the unconquerable sun, the god of the light between heaven and earth, worshipped at that time by an influential Roman cult. His birth symbolized an end to the long nights and a return to the dominance of the sun. During the month-long winter solstice celebration, courts in Rome were closed. Any and all crimes were allowed. Homosexuality, cross-dressing, and uncontrolled debauchery reigned supreme. Rome's order was turned upside down. Even children were allowed to join in the drunken orgies as part of the Juvenalia celebration. By 270 AD, the Roman Emperor Aurelian had made it official, setting aside a 7-day period from December the 17th through the 24th, culminating in an exchange of gifts on December the 25th to celebrate the birth of the sun god. This Roman orgy to end all orgies later became known as Saturnalia, in honor of the god Saturn, the god of excess. Roman soldiers invading Britain brought with them their pagan orgiastic traditions. Upon taking root in England, Saturnalia became known as the Festival of Fools, reigned over by the Lord of Misrule. By the 4th century, the influential government-sanctioned Church of Rome, unable to outlaw the growing number of pagan practices, chose instead to adopt them into their so-called official Christianity. The Church believed this would attract more pagans to their fold. Up until this time, the birthday of Jesus Christ, the Jewish Messiah, had not been celebrated at all. Ignoring scriptures, however, indicating that the birth probably did not occur during the winter, the Church nevertheless confused biblical history and made Jesus' birthday coincide with the pagan god Mithra. The birth date of the sun god had now become the birth date of the Son of God. It was hoped that the pagan celebrations of Saturnalia would merge into this new legally sanctioned form of Christianity. The Church's practice of changing the dates of Christian events to coincide with pagan festivals continued, and by the 7th century, Pope Gregory I had ordered Augustine of Canterbury to incorporate any and all pagan practices and customs into the expanding Roman Catholic Church. During the Middle Ages, the debased Mardi Gras atmosphere of what was now known as Christ's Mass had reached a fevered pitch. Common practices included open sex in the streets, rioting, murder, and a number of pagan druidic Halloween rituals. This blood-drenched celebration got so out of hand that by 1652, following the execution of King Charles I, Christ's Mass was finally outlawed in England. A religious reform movement began sweeping the country, led by Puritan Oliver Cromwell. The Puritans took the biblical mandate seriously, which commanded that Christianity remain pure and separate from paganism. Despite their noble efforts, the celebration simply went underground, and by 1656, after only 4 short years under the ban, the public's demand for the legalization of Christ's Mass had become insurmountable. The appointment of Charles II to the throne restored England's monarchy, and with it the celebration of Christ's Mass. The Puritans had lost England, but they held high hopes for the new world.
When the first settlers came from England, they were, for the most part, Puritans. They came here for religious freedom. They came here to be free to worship God without a hierarchy and without the corruption of the organized church that they had known before. And when they came with the clear knowledge of the danger of these pagan practices that had become so dear to the hearts of their ancestors.
Following England's lead in 1659, the colonies of America had likewise outlawed Christmas. For 200 years, the clergy in New England battled to keep the riotous celebrations honoring the pagan god Saturn from infiltrating the New World. The Reverend Cotton Mather had warned in a Christmas Day sermon in 1712, "Can you in your conscience think that your Holy Saviour is honoured by hard drinking, lewd revelling, and by a mass fit for none but Bacchus or Saturn?" But the public's taste for sin and revelry persisted. In 1828, gang rioting during the Saturnalia-like Christmas celebrations got so bad that cities such as New York were forced to institute a professional police force for the first time in order to control the savagery.
Christmas was not only not widely celebrated, in many cases, many places, Christmas celebrations were actually outlawed. And this was because of the attitude of many of the churches who regarded it as primarily as a pagan celebration and as a reproach to the Lord.
By the mid-19th century, American churches were the last remaining holdout in the war against the validation of Christmas. However, they too finally succumbed as a result of the efforts of the American Sunday School Society, who began advocating Christmas programs for children as a method of filling the pews. The Society argued that children could be taught about the birth of Christ through the reenactment of the Nativity. They also offered candy and treats to the children as a means of enticing families into accepting the holiday, despite its notorious history and blatantly pagan roots. The successful technique of bribing children with candy would later be used on an unsuspecting American populace in the effort to promote the acceptance of the pagan rituals of Halloween. However, it was the work of England's most popular writer, Charles Dickens, whose ghostly 1843 book, A Christmas Carol, cemented the Christmas holiday in the hearts of Americans forever. Dickens' well-loved story made the pagan Christmas feasts, shining trees, glittering shops, and family warmth irresistible to those wanting to experience the holiday. Coming to America in 1867 to promote his work, Charles Dickens packed theaters as he read his story to cheering audiences around the country. A Christmas Carol gripped America and destroyed any final attempt to stop the evolution of Christmas. By 1875, the Puritans had been beaten, and by 1890, all American states had voted to make Christmas a legal holiday. Today's tradition of the Christmas Yule log stems directly from the worship of the pre-Christian Scandinavian fertility god Yule. The burning of this phallic idol is also responsible for the concept of the 12 days of Christmas, which represented the 12 daily sacrifices offered up in the Yule log's flames.
Another good example of the pagan elements of Christmas is the whole concept of Yule and the Yule log. The very term is derived from a Norse god, Yule, spelled J-U-L. And every year around Christmas time, a huge log was cut down and fashioned into a fertility symbol and then burned for 12 days. And on each successive day, a new sacrifice to the god Yule was performed in the fire, and a new sacrificial victim was burned to death. Sometimes, but not always, these sacrificial victims were human beings. And the whole notion of the 12 days of Christmas also comes to us from this Norse pagan tradition.
In an attempt to blur the origins of this horrific ritual, the Church of Rome placed the first day of the Mass of Christ on December 25th and the 12th day on January the 6th. Despite no scriptural references for January the 6th, it was selected as the day the wise men supposedly arrived to offer gifts to the newborn Christ. This day then has become known as Epiphany. During the Dark Ages, the European custom of putting an oil-lighted wick lamp in the windows during the 12 days of Christmas signified to neighbors that the occupants were participating in the pagan worship of the phallic idol Yule. In today's commercialism, this is where we get the tradition of decorating our houses with Christmas lights. The Yule log custom was originally brought over to America by Scandinavian immigrants during the 1600s. And despite attempts to ban the tradition, it has stayed with us to this very day. Today, when we wish someone Yuletide greetings, we are in a sense invoking the power of the fertility god Yule upon that person. During the Saturnalia celebrations, holly and other greens were hung over doorways as part of a pagan ritual to ward off evil. To deck the halls with boughs of holly was to acknowledge the powers of the nature gods. According to Wiccan rituals, placing holly or other greens in the shape of a circle or wreath accentuated its magical power. Similarly, mistletoe, when used in the casting of Wiccan or Druidic spells, could render a woman helpless and open to sexual exploitation. This is where we get our custom of hanging mistletoe in doorways today, and if a woman is caught underneath, she may be kissed and must not resist.
The fir tree, the mistletoe, all of these things typically come from overtly pagan traditions, typically from Northern Europe, German, Norse, and English.
Likewise, evergreen trees have always represented sex and fertility in pagan cultures. During the winter solstice, trees would be chopped down, brought inside, set up, and decorated as idols for worship.
The Christmas tree was regarded as a sacred tree. The pagans of Northern Europe typically worshipped trees. They regarded trees and groves as sacred. So the bringing of the tree into the house would be a way of bringing this supernatural source of blessing into your home. That was the whole idea, that there were spirits who resided in the trees.
In the Middle Ages, the tradition of the winter solstice Christmas tree primarily took root in Germany. During his reign, King George I, himself of German extraction, brought the custom to Victorian England. German immigrants settling in Pennsylvania did the same in America during the early 1800s. In 1848, the London Illustrated News published this famous engraving depicting Queen Victoria and her royal family beside a decorated Christmas tree. And within a few years, nearly every English household had their own tree in allegiance to the monarchy. By 1900, the U.S. Forest Service estimated that at least 1 in 5 homes in America had adopted the Christmas tree tradition. Thousands of years earlier, God, speaking through the prophet Jeremiah, warned against this pagan practice in the Old Testament. Thus saith the Lord, learn not the ways of the heathen, for the customs of the people are vain. For one cutteth a tree out of the forest, they deck it with silver and with gold. They fasten it with nails and hammers that it move not. Be not afraid of them, for they cannot do evil, neither also is it in them to do good.
Santa Claus is another good example of a pagan element of Christmas. Santa Claus, as we know him today, is an amalgamation of several different traditions, but in most cultures throughout the world, you will find the existence of what is known as hearth gods, gods who guard the hearth and the chimney and keep the fires burning and make sure the food cooks properly and the people are warm and what have you. And at a certain time of year, in the middle of winter, typically, the hearth god dressed in red will come down the chimney to reward those who have pleased him during the course of the previous year, and to lay curses or hexes or other forms of punishment upon people who have displeased him.
The concept of Santa Claus has had a long and winding history, with a number of diverse cultures contributing to the composite character we have today. Beginning once again in Scandinavia, Santa's original incarnation was in the form of Odin, the pagan god of thunder, a tall fellow with a long flowing beard who inhabited the spirit-infested Nordic forests. Odin would travel the sky during the winter solstice, deciding who would die and who would prosper. Most believers were frightened of this particular time of year. In England, Odin eventually evolved into Father Christmas, who, crowned with sprigs of holly, traveled the countryside getting roaring drunk as part of the Festival of Fools celebration. Frequently, he would be accompanied by a horned goat, ironically the biblical symbol of those who reject the salvation of Jesus Christ. According to the traditions of the Church of Rome, there was a Turkish bishop named Nicholas who hailed from Myra in Asia Minor during the 4th century. He was known as the patron saint of seafaring men. Over the centuries, as the legend began to unfold, it was rumored that St. Nicholas had actually captured the devil himself, put him in chains, and made him his personal servant. Recognized in various cultures as Krampus, Beelzebub, or Zwart Piet, Black Peter, this assistant of St. Nicholas is best known by his German name, Knecht Ruprecht. Described as a hideous horned creature, the servant Ruprecht was a dark and sinister figure who stood in stark contrast to the saintly Nicholas. Somehow, Father Christmas's companion, the horned goat, had metamorphosized into the foreboding horned devil called Ruprecht. As St. Nicholas traveled from house to house, inquiring about the behavior of children, Ruprecht would drop candy and gifts down the chimney into the good children's shoes which had been placed there. It was from this story that we get our tradition of hanging stockings on the mantle at Christmas time. If able to recite a verse or demonstrate a skill for St. Nicholas, the child would receive a gift. If unable to remember a verse, or if the child had been bad, he or she would receive a switch or a whip. Ruprecht also carried a large sack which he would frequently use to haul away the really bad boys and girls. As more and more Christian churches began combining the pagan rituals of the winter solstice with the celebration of the birth of Christ, emphasis on St. Nicholas's role began to shift. Some cultures began to downplay the role of St. Nicholas, but surprisingly retained Ruprecht. Eventually, Knecht Ruprecht was made the companion and servant to the Christ child himself. In this scenario, the devil is actually given the title Weihnachtsmann, or Santa Claus. 19th century writer Theodor Storm, in his story about Knecht Ruprecht, even goes so far as to describe the switches given to the children by Ruprecht as tools to be used in sadomasochistic rituals. Soon, the image of Ruprecht would fade from the Christmas tradition, but not his sadistic influence. Many of the early depictions of Santa Claus portrayed him not as a jolly gift giver, but of an unfriendly disciplinarian, complete with a ready switch or whip.
One of the problems with the Christmas gift thing for children is that it really is a religious teaching, a wrong religious teaching, because it teaches them that if they're nice, they get the gifts. If they're naughty, they don't. Or in my case, I was taught that he would leave us a bundle of switches Isn't that interesting? It's a salvation by my own personal virtue. But there's a second thing wrong with it, and that is that they're going to get those gifts whether they're naughty or nice, because most parents love their children and wouldn't dream of, quote, ruining their Christmas. And they're not going to ruin Christmas. They're going to give those children the gifts anyway. And sooner or later, those thinking children are going to realize, I wasn't very nice, but I got the gift anyway. So it isn't important to be nice. It isn't important to do what is right and avoid what is wrong.
German immigrants coming to America during the 1620s tried to influence the New World with the stories of St. Nicholas and his gift-giving companion, Knecht Ruprecht. But somehow the idea just didn't take hold until almost 200 years later. In 1819, America's best-selling author, Washington Irving, used his influence to promote St. Nicholas in a popular Christmas story titled Bracebridge Hall. Consulting Irving's writings, Episcopalian minister Clement Clark Moore penned a decidedly secular tale called A Visit from St. Nicholas in 1822. Later retitled The Night Before Christmas, Moore's poem was based on the tales of German and Dutch immigrants who had come to America. Intended originally only for his own children, Moore's story was published in the Troy Sentinel in New York and became an overnight sensation. Gone were the bishop's remnant of St. Nicholas. He was now a jolly old elf imbued with supernatural powers. Moore had also replaced Nicholas's companion, the horned Knecht Ruprecht, with 8 horned magical reindeer. As the popularity of The Night Before Christmas grew, Moore became increasingly concerned that the story's emphasis on the supernatural and its disregard for Christ would reflect poorly on his position as a minister. As a result, he refused to take credit for its creation until the story became so popular that he could no longer resist. 40 years later, illustrator Thomas Nast, political cartoonist for Harper's Weekly, seared the image of Santa Claus into the minds of the world by creating a drawing which combined Moore's jolly old elf with images of St. Nicholas taken from his own native Bavaria. By 1880, Santa was a thoroughly secularized folk hero who had become increasingly irresistible to retailers worldwide.
One factor that has contributed to the paganization of Christmas, the complete paganization of Christmas, has been the element of commercialism. It may seem odd to think of it in that context, but remember that Christ himself identified the love of money as a spiritual force in and of itself. And where it comes into play, it has a kind of naturally hostile effect on the gospel and the Christian faith. So the commercialization of Christmas has helped to highlight the pagan elements and to drive the overtly Christian elements further underground.
To me, the most obscene thing about Christmas celebrations and customs as we know them is that as a result of these things, Jesus is displaced in the hearts of children by Santa Claus. The love, affection, appreciation, trust, the desire to emulate, these things that they should have in their hearts and minds as growing children for Jesus himself, to whom they owe everything. Instead, this has been stolen, this has been raped out of their hearts in a sense and displaced by the myth of Santa Claus.
He takes the place of God or of Jesus Christ in the special world that is Christmas. He has supernatural knowledge of your history. He has supernatural knowledge of your present, of your attitudes. He's keeping a list. He knows who's naughty and nice. Your parents don't even know that. He's obviously got some conduit to knowledge that is beyond the human, and he flies through the air. Capable of visiting every place on the globe in the course of a single night. In many, many ways, Santa exhibits supernatural qualities that provide a kind of a surrogate deity or a substitute for God or for Christ.
Myths, by definition, evolve and change, and things are added. We used to have a Santa Claus figure that was confused with St. Nicholas and confused with other pagan figures, and then somehow he evolved through the drawings of Thomas Nast and others into what we see today, but he had a sleigh with 8 supernatural reindeer that can fly. And so the Christmas traditions that are pagan continue to change. But the truth of Jesus, the truth of the incarnation, the truth that the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us, never changes, never will.
Various scriptures in the Bible, including the 2nd chapter of Luke, record the events surrounding the birth of the Messiah. A decree from Caesar Augustus had gone out, requiring all people to return to the city of their origin for taxation purposes. Mary, who was pregnant with a child conceived by the Holy Spirit, made the difficult journey to Bethlehem along with her husband Joseph. Both Joseph and Mary were of the lineage of King David. Upon arrival, they found all the inns to be full, but were provided with a stable where Mary could have her baby. At the same time, an angel announcing the birth of the Messiah appeared to shepherds tending their flocks in a field nearby. The stunned shepherds hurried to Bethlehem and found the baby Jesus lying in a manger just as the angel had declared. Although traditional nativity scenes placed 3 wise men at the stable at the time of Jesus Christ's birth, according to Scripture, these wise men visited Jesus later at his home. Because 3 gifts are named, gold, frankincense and myrrh, tradition says 3 men gave them, but exactly how many wise men visited Jesus is not known. The birth of Jesus Christ miraculously fulfilled a number of Old Testament prophecies about the coming Messiah, including that he would be born in Bethlehem, that he would be born of a virgin, and that he would be a descendant of King David's.
The concept or the idea of celebrating the birth of Jesus once a year had apparently never occurred to the Church Fathers. In the first 3 centuries of the Church's history, there was no such thing. And I think God perhaps very carefully avoided telling us in the Scriptures when he was born. We can be sure of one thing: it wasn't in late December, and because in the first place shepherds don't abide by their flocks in the fields by night in late December. It's too cold. They take them out in the morning to pasture, protect them while they eat all day, and then bring them back in at night. So it wasn't in late December. It's an interesting thing, and perhaps an intellectually tantalizing thought, to try to figure out when he was born. And it can be done within limits, and if it mattered, and apparently it doesn't matter to God, he was probably born in late September.
Some scholars point out that according to Scripture, the birth of Jesus may have taken place in the first day of the Feast of Tabernacles, or September 29th. For some, Christmas today simply means a time to get together as a family. For pagans, it is a deeply religious time to celebrate the winter solstice. Retailers, of course, view it with eyes towards making huge profits. Others use this time to reflect on the birth or conception of Jesus Christ, while many parents use Christmas to perpetuate the myth of Santa Claus to their children.
In order to carry on this myth of Santa Claus, we must lie to our children. We must deceive them. We literally must lie to our children. And one of the wonderful things about children is that they naturally believe everything that we tell them when they're small. They trust us to tell them the truth. And if we deceive them in this way, it has to be destructive, because at some point in their future lives, they're going to wonder if other things we told them were true. The things we told them about the Lord, were they really true? It plants the seeds of doubt. And anyway, it creates disappointment. It creates disillusionment.
What Christians should be most concerned about, however, are the growing pagan influences infiltrating every area of our rapidly degenerating society. Recently, we took our cameras to the Nevada desert, where we witnessed 35,000 pagans from around the country participating in a week-long celebration of sex, drugs, and hedonism. Here, everything was permissible and encouraged, except for the adoration of Jesus Christ. In nearly every ritual performed, Christianity was mercilessly mocked and despised. Each year, the numbers of participants continues to grow. Its attraction is expanding worldwide as it recruits through the internet. It is sobering to witness what could be the wave of the future unfolding before our eyes.
It is not only permitted in the public schools, in the government schools, to celebrate holidays. It is encouraged and in some instances required. But with this condition, they must be pagan. They must not be Christian. And Christmas time, they are certainly encouraged to put on Christmas programs and Christmas plays. But all references to Jesus, all references to the gospel, all references to the incarnation, all references to God must be omitted. They sing about Santa Claus, they sing about Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, and God only knows what else they sing about that isn't scriptural.
Since the pagan elements in Christmas are so strong, and they provide virtually the entirety of the structure and the content of the holiday, there is no Christian element in the holiday. Therefore, it becomes the ideal, politically correct, culturally diverse, multicultural holiday for everyone.
In the 17th chapter of John, Jesus taught that it was appropriate for his followers to be in the world, but not of the world, meaning that we should be involved in our world so as to have a positive influence, but not become corrupted by it. The mighty Joshua, in challenging his people, said, "Now therefore fear the Lord, and serve him in sincerity and in truth, and put away the other gods which your fathers served. Choose you this day whom ye will serve, but as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." Rather than setting aside a few days of the year to remember the Lord, Christians should live with a day-by-day, moment-by-moment dedication of their entire lives to Jesus Christ. Then, and only then, will they be able to have victory over pagan influences and to have an impact on society for God the Creator. To those with a heart for evangelism, Christmas time provides a wonderful opportunity to tell others about the true gospel, about God's plan of redemption, and the real purpose for Jesus Christ entering the world.